Ethan Hale once believed life had a rhythm. Work hard, stay honest, be kind, and the world would eventually return the favor. That belief carried him through long nights in a small apartment and through dreams he never said out loud, a quiet hope that life would unfold gently if he just kept going. But illusions don't last forever, and his fell apart on a freezing night when he walked home from the insurance office where he worked, exhausted but hopeful, his backpack filled with unfinished paperwork. He expected silence when he reached his apartment, not the glow of lights through the curtains or the shadow moving inside. His mind tried to protect him with excuses, but the truth stood sharp when he opened the door and saw Lena, his partner of 6 years, holding another man's face with soft tenderness, like Ethan had never mattered. She froze. The man didn't. And Ethan felt something steady inside him crack. He didn't argue, didn't ask why, didn't beg for answers. He simply walked out hollow, unaware that betrayal was only the beginning. 3 days later, he was fired, accused of fraud, of altering files he had never touched. Someone with access to his login had set him up, and that someone was the same man he'd found with Lena, a senior manager with power and no conscience. By nightfall, Ethan had lost his reputation, his income, and the apartment he could no longer afford. When he returned home that evening, he discovered Lena had drained his savings and left a sticky note that read, "You're better off without me." He didn't laugh. He couldn't. Something inside him was too broken for sound. Instead of collapsing, Ethan disappeared across 3 states into a small mountain town where no one knew him. He lived alone in a cold cabin, the silence pressing against him until pain became a teacher instead of an enemy. He ran through the woods each morning until his lungs burned, lifted rusted weights until his arms shook, and wrote down every lie he had believed, every soft, trusting part of himself that had made betrayal so easy, then tore each page apart. Slowly, he shed the man he used to be and built a version of himself that didn't break when life pushed. He learned people's patterns, learned control, learned calmness, sharper than anger. Strength didn't become muscle. It became clarity. 6 months later, when he stepped out of the cabin and walked down the mountain road, there was no softness left in him, only cold resolve and a quiet fire that didn't flicker. He wasn't returning to his old life. He was going back to reclaim it. And the men who ruined him would soon learn he wasn't the same man they had destroyed. He had returned with armor they couldn't penetrate. Ethan didn't rush back into the world when he left the mountain. He moved like a man studying the ground before each step, measuring every breath, every thought, every possibility. The first town he entered felt too bright, too loud, too full of people wrapped in their small routines. He watched them quietly, unnoticed, blending into the noise like a shadow without a name. He found work at a freight warehouse, the kind of place where nobody asked questions as long as the work got done. The others joked, complained, argued, but Ethan was silent, disciplined, and unsettling in a way he didn't intend to be. He showed up on time, lifted more than anyone else, finished faster, and never smiled. Some avoided him, some respected him, but none dared to get close. He used the long, empty nights in the rough apartment above the warehouse to sharpen his mind. He read about manipulation, psychology, human dynamics, learning how people hid their intentions behind gestures and tones. He studied patterns of power, how corrupt men climbed, how weak men folded, how naive men got crushed. Every page felt like a weapon he was forging, one he planned to use one day. He trained harder, pushing himself past exhaustion, building a body that felt like steel wrapped in calm. But what transformed him the most was the quiet realization that strength wasn't revenge. It was becoming someone impossible to break again. Still, revenge simmered like a low flame, patient and controlled. Some nights he saw Lena's face in his mind, not with longing, but with a cold clarity that left no room for softness. Some nights he saw the manager, Daniel Mercer, the man who framed him, smirking as if Ethan's life had been a disposable inconvenience. Ethan didn't hate them. Hatred was too emotional, too consuming. What he carried now was something cleaner, purpose. It guided every action, every breath, every quiet decision. 6 months into this new life, Ethan found something he didn't expect. Not love, not forgiveness, but direction. The warehouse owner trusted him enough to offer him more responsibility, access to night logs, shipping lists, and staff schedules. Ethan didn't ask for it, but he accepted it. With each small step he earned, he saw something else. He was good with people, not emotionally, logically. He could read them with almost alarming accuracy. He could sense lies before they were spoken. He understood motives without asking questions. And people followed him, even without him trying. That was the moment he realized he'd been blind for most of his life. His softness wasn't kindness. It was ignorance. His trust wasn't love. It was self-abandonment. And his loyalty wasn't strength. It was surrender. This clarity didn't make him cruel, but it made him colder. He no longer explained himself. He no longer waited for fairness. He no longer saw the world as a place that rewarded goodness. Instead, he saw systems, patterns, leverage. And with every new insight, the man who had been destroyed became the man building his comeback. One foggy morning, while he finished loading a freight truck, he overheard a group of workers talking about a corporate training event happening 2 states over. The name of the company hit him like a quiet strike. Weston and Hale Insurance, his old workplace. Hearing it didn't bring rage. It brought something sharper, opportunity. He stayed still, hands resting on a wooden pallet, listening without reacting. They talked about restructuring, promotions, and how a new director, Daniel Mercer, had been praised for cleaning up internal inefficiencies, which Ethan knew was corporate language for framing someone who trusted him. Mercer had risen because Ethan had fallen. The realization didn't break him. It sharpened him. That night, Ethan sat alone in his apartment, the dim yellow light flickering against the walls as he planned quietly, methodically. He didn't want to ruin Mercer the way Mercer had ruined him. That would be too easy, too loud, too emotional. Ethan wanted something deeper. He wanted truth to corner Mercer, consequences to swallow him, and justice to unfold without Ethan ever needing to show his face. He didn't want revenge that made him feel better. He wanted justice that couldn't be undone. He spent weeks mapping out everything he remembered. Names, dates, patterns, weaknesses in the office structure, people who disliked Mercer, people Mercer had stepped on to climb. Memory became ammunition. Discipline became fuel. Silence became armor. Ethan wasn't going back for closure. He wasn't going back for Lena. He wasn't going back for the life he lost. He was going back to take everything that was his, and everything Mercer never deserved. But Ethan understood timing better than he ever had. He wouldn't rush. He wouldn't stumble in angry and unprepared. He would build himself into the one thing Mercer never saw coming, a man who couldn't be broken, manipulated, or deceived. A man with nothing left to lose and everything left to reclaim. A man rebuilt from cold fire and silent determination. Months passed and Ethan's plan grew roots, branching into something sharper, more dangerous, more deliberate. He watched the world closely, learned how decisions move people like pieces on a board. He strengthened his body, his mind, his patience. And then, one late autumn evening, he opened his laptop, searched the company's website, and discovered something that made him lean back slowly, breathing with a calm he had worked hard to master. The company was hosting an open hiring event, an event led by Daniel Mercer himself. Ethan didn't smile, but something inside him finally, quietly clicked into place. It was time to walk back into the world that had destroyed him. Only now, he wasn't the man they remembered. He was the storm walking in through the front door, Ethan didn't prepare for the hiring event like a desperate man chasing a second chance. He prepared like a strategist entering hostile territory, studying everything from the company's recent financial shifts to every public post Daniel Mercer had made over the last year. He memorized faces of new executives, tracked department turnover rates, and even examined the floor plan of the event hall, noting exits, corners, and blind spots, not because he planned anything violent, but because control over a space meant control over himself. The morning of the event, he dressed simply. Black shirt, dark jacket, clean cut but unnoticed. He looked like any hard-working man seeking stability, not like someone walking toward the man who had dismantled his life for convenience. The hall was crowded, filled with job seekers clutching resumes and recruiters exchanging plastic smiles. Ethan walked through them with steady steps, absorbing every detail but revealing nothing. Conversations buzzed around him, hope, nerves, ambition, but none of it touched him. His mind was a quiet blade, sharp and focused. When Daniel Mercer finally appeared on the small stage at the front, the room shifted into applause, but Ethan remained still, watching the man who had once been nothing more than a shadow in his apartment doorway. Mercer looked polished, confident, almost charming in a rehearsed corporate way. To everyone else, he was a successful leader. To Ethan, he was a coward wearing a borrowed crown. Ethan observed the subtle details, Mercer's forced smile lines, the stiffness in his shoulders, the mechanical pauses in his speech. This wasn't confidence. It was a man performing a version of himself he wished was real. And Ethan knew pretenders when he saw them now. After the introduction, attendees formed lines for quick one-on-one conversations with departmental managers. Ethan didn't approach Mercer yet. He approached the people around him, the assistants, the clerks, the staff who always saw more than they were supposed to. He asked simple questions, listened more than he spoke, and let them talk. People opened up around him without understanding why. There was something about his calmness that drew out their truths. Within an hour, he'd learned that Mercer had made enemies. Quiet ones, hidden ones, the kind who smiled when he walked past but whispered when he left the room. Ethan tucked their frustrations into the growing structure of his plan like puzzle pieces. Later, when the crowd thinned, Ethan finally stepped toward Mercer's section. Mercer was reviewing someone's resume, nodding with an expression that didn't reach his eyes. Ethan waited silently. When Mercer looked up at him, there was no recognition at first, just the mechanical politeness of a man trained to scan faces and forget them. Ethan felt nothing. No rage, no panic, no shaking hands. He had already burned the old version of himself who would have begged for truth or justice. Mercer's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Ethan to see a flicker of discomfort, like his subconscious sensed something. Ethan kept his voice steady, low, professional, as he introduced himself under a different name. Mercer nodded politely, unaware that the man standing in front of him was the ghost of the life he thought he had erased. Ethan spoke about logistics work, leadership, efficiency, things Mercer liked to hear. But he wasn't trying to get hired. He was studying Mercer's reactions, how he handled pressure when Ethan subtly pressed his weak spots with specific questions. Questions about internal audits, about case files, about account security protocols. Mercer stiffened each time, just slightly, the micro expressions of a guilty man trying to stay composed. Ethan recorded every twitch, every hesitation in his memory. When the conversation ended, Mercer shook his hand with a forced smile, dismissing him like any other hopeful applicant. Ethan walked away without glancing back. The real meeting had already taken place. The meeting where Ethan confirmed that Mercer wasn't just corrupt, he was vulnerable. Leaving the event hall, Ethan stepped into the cold air, letting it fill his lungs. This wasn't victory. It wasn't revenge. It was the first real step in a long, calculated reclamation. He returned to his apartment and laid out everything he had learned. The weaknesses in Mercer's circle, the co-workers secretly waiting for him to fall, the digital systems that could expose the lies Mercer had buried. Ethan knew this wouldn't be fast. Justice worth having never was, but he had patience forged from months in silence. He had clarity sharpened from pain. And he had something Mercer never planned for, a version of Ethan that could not be manipulated, broken, or blindsided. The man Mercer destroyed was gone. In his place was someone who understood the world not as it should be, but as it was. A man who saw systems, pressure points, consequences. A man who could walk into the life he lost not with noise, but with precision. The storm wasn't coming later. It was already here. Quiet, invisible, contained inside Ethan's steady breath as he stared at the city lights outside his window. Mercer would never see it coming. And Lena, wherever she was, would one day realize the biggest mistake she ever made wasn't leaving Ethan. It was creating the version of him who would rise from the ruins stronger than anything they could ever break. Ethan had rebuilt himself, not with rage, but with purpose. And now that purpose had direction. He was ready. The world just didn't know it yet. Ethan didn't return to the warehouse after the hiring event with excitement or fear. He returned with a strange, steady stillness, the kind that settles into a man who finally knows the direction of his next breath. The apartment was dim when he walked inside, the old floor creaking beneath his boots. But instead of sitting, instead of resting, he moved directly to his small wooden desk and opened his notebook, the same one he'd filled for months with patterns, insights, and quiet strategies. He wrote down everything he had observed about Mercer, the stiffness in his jaw when audits were mentioned, the sideways glance when Ethan asked about account security, the faint tremor in his fingers when Ethan pressed him with questions wrapped politely in curiosity. Mercer's reactions weren't just guilt. They were fear disguised as professionalism. Ethan studied those reactions with the calm precision of a surgeon preparing for an incision. He knew from experience that people like Mercer didn't fear moral consequences. They feared exposure, losing power, losing the image they had built brick by fragile brick. Mercer had climbed higher since the day he destroyed Ethan. But the higher a man climbed on a lie, the harder he fell under truth. Ethan closed the notebook slowly, breathing out a cold, focused breath as he leaned back in his chair. For the first time in months, he felt something close to clarity, like he was finally stepping into the version of himself he had been building in silence. He wasn't chasing revenge in anger. He was constructing justice with patience. And justice required information. That night, he opened his laptop and began mapping out the digital landscape of Weston and Hale Insurance, public reports, leadership structures, departmental logs, article archives, alumni databases. Every piece of information he collected became another thread in a web he was slowly spinning around Mercer's legacy. The company had changed, expanded, and rebranded its departments since he left. But some things stayed the same. Human nature, weaknesses, ambition. Ethan spent hours studying how promotions were granted, who held grudges against Mercer, and which employees looked like they were carrying burdens behind their professional smiles. He didn't need to guess. He needed precision. And precision came from observation. He stayed awake until the sky outside turned pale, a thin strip of dawn stretching across the horizon. He closed his eyes only when his mind finally reached a point of quiet certainty. To bring Mercer down, he wouldn't expose him outright. That would only create chaos, noise, denial. No. Ethan would create a collapse so clean, so silent, so undeniable that Mercer wouldn't have time to spin a story or pin blame on anyone else. He would build a scenario where the truth was so complete, so clear, so unavoidable, that even Mercer's closest allies would step away in fear of sinking with him. Ethan would dismantle the man's entire foundation, and he would do it from the shadows. The next day at the warehouse felt different, not because work changed, but because Ethan had. Every movement he made was measured, intentional. He worked quietly, efficiently, but with a deeper purpose stitched into each step. His co-workers talked around him the way they always did, unaware that the man lifting crates beside them was preparing the downfall of someone who had once thrown him to ruin. During his lunch break, Ethan sat alone on the concrete steps outside the loading bay, watching trucks pull in and out while sipping a plain black coffee that had long gone cold. He wasn't thinking about Mercer. He was thinking about Lena. Not with longing or heartbreak, those emotions had been burned away in the woods, but with a strange sense of closure he didn't expect. He realized he didn't hate her. She was a chapter that ended in flames, yes, but a chapter that led him here, to the man he had become. She had taken everything from him, but in doing so, she had stripped him down to the truth, forcing him to build strength not from comfort, but from emptiness. Loss had become the soil where his new identity grew, and while he didn't forgive her, he understood her role. Pain shapes people. And she had shaped him into someone she would never recognize now. Later that evening, after the shift ended, Ethan walked the long route back to his apartment, choosing the quieter back streets where old brick buildings leaned into each other like tired strangers. He moved with the steady confidence of a man who had survived his own destruction and come out sharper. When he reached the apartment, he didn't turn on the lights. He didn't need them. Instead, he sat at his desk again and began crafting the first real stage of his plan. He needed allies, people with access, information, and motives of their own, and he knew exactly where to find them. Every company had people who knew the truth behind the polished corporate walls, assistants who overheard conversations, analysts who saw discrepancies, older employees who had been passed over for promotions, and new hires who questioned why certain people rose too quickly. All Ethan needed to do was identify the right ones and then become their silent catalyst. He started by digging deeper into social media trails, staff directories, conference photos, and employee testimonials. He searched for expressions, eyes that looked tired, strained, frustrated in group pictures. He studied body language the way some studied maps. A forced smile, a distant stare, a stiff posture. These subtle cues told him who carried unspoken truths. He found one in particular, a woman named Claire Donovan, an administrative coordinator who had worked at the company for 8 years. In every photo, she stood slightly behind the group, offering a polite smile that never touched her eyes. Her job gave her proximity to Mercer's meetings, schedules, and internal communications. And judging by her subtle expressions, she wasn't loyal to him. She was surviving him. Ethan read through her posts carefully, noting the patterns of a person carrying stress that had no outlet. She was the kind of person who noticed everything but said nothing. Exactly the kind of person Mercer underestimated, exactly the kind of person Ethan needed. He reached out the next day, not with direct questions, not with suspicion, but with something she hadn't felt in years, being genuinely listened to. He crafted a simple message through a professional networking site, asking about her experience at the company and expressing interest in applying. He knew she wouldn't reply immediately. People like Claire were cautious, guarded, slow to trust, and that was fine. Ethan wasn't rushing. He was building, and he had learned on the mountain that anything built too fast collapses. Yet, to his quiet surprise, she responded that same night, not with details, but with a single line that made Ethan sit back in his chair, eyes narrowing slightly. "Are you sure Weston and Hale is where you want to work? Some people there aren't what they pretend to be." Ethan didn't smile, but a single thought formed with precision in his mind. She knows something. She was the first thread, and he would pull carefully, unraveling the truth piece by piece until Mercer's carefully constructed world began to come apart from within. Ethan didn't reply to Claire's message immediately. He let it sit, knowing that people who finally speak after years of silence often retreat if pushed too quickly. Instead, he waited until morning, when the world felt quieter, calmer, and minds hadn't yet built their daily defenses. His response was simple. I appreciate your honesty. I'm trying to understand the company better before making a decision. If you're open to sharing more, I'd value your insight. He didn't promise anything, didn't flatter her, didn't pry. He simply offered space. Claire didn't answer for almost a full day. Ethan went through his routine as usual, work, training, studying, but part of his mind remained fixed on that message, sensing that she was turning something over in her thoughts. People didn't risk truth lightly, especially in corporate environments where secrets were currency and fear was leverage. That night, as he stood in his small kitchen sipping water, his phone buzzed. Claire had replied, "It's not my place to talk about others, but be careful. Some decisions here have hurt people, and some people were blamed for things they didn't do." Ethan felt his pulse steady, not quicken. She was speaking about him without knowing it. Her message wasn't bold, but it was enough to confirm what he suspected. She had seen something. Maybe not everything, but enough to know the system was cracked under Mercer's polished smile. He responded with gratitude, again without pressure. Over the next week, their conversations grew slowly, like a plant pushing through hard soil. Claire never overshared. Her messages were cautious, thoughtful, always phrased in ways that protected her job. But beneath the careful words, Ethan sensed exhaustion. Years of carrying truths she couldn't say aloud, and he offered her what no one else had, understanding without judgment. He didn't need to act like her friend. He needed to be someone who saw her, really saw her, in ways Mercer never did, and quietly, she began to trust him. During this time, Ethan also expanded his search for potential allies. He found a young analyst named Jordan Vance, whose exit interview, publicly available through a professional site, held faint traces of bitterness wrapped in politeness. Jordan had left Weston and Hale only 3 months earlier, citing misalignment with departmental ethics. Ethan reached out under the guise of career exploration. Jordan replied the same day, eager to talk to anyone who wasn't blind to what he had witnessed. Their video call lasted almost an hour. Ethan kept his camera off, citing a bad connection, wanting Jordan to speak freely without seeing Ethan's face. Jordan explained how some accounts had strange inconsistencies, how certain financial trails were altered then quickly sealed, and how anyone who questioned those irregularities ended up reassigned, reprimanded, or suddenly under HR investigation. Ethan listened without interruption, every word Jordan said validating the truths he had known from the beginning. Mercer didn't rise by accident. He rose through carefully constructed sabotage. Jordan didn't know Ethan's story, didn't know he was speaking to the man whose reputation had been deliberately sacrificed to give Mercer a career boost, but Ethan took notes, cataloging every detail. When the call ended, Jordan thanked him for listening, saying, "Most people don't care about the truth. They care about stability. But the truth still stains everything, you know? Even after you leave." Ethan thanked him, but inside a deeper resolve formed like steel cooling into shape. The truth did stain, and Mercer's hands were drenched in it. Meanwhile, Claire continued messaging him in small pieces. She shared tiny fragments, strange meetings held behind closed doors, files disappearing from shared drives, employees abruptly resigning after private conversations. She mentioned one detail that made Ethan lean forward slightly in his chair as he read, "Mercer keeps a personal device he never connects to the company network. I've seen him take it into meetings he wants no record of." A personal device meant off-book communication, secrets, evidence, vulnerabilities. Every corrupt man kept something hidden somewhere, convinced he was smarter than the system he manipulated. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He let the weight of her words settle. The device was a key, not the only key, but a door into Mercer's private world, and every door had a hinge that could break. As days passed, Ethan began constructing a layered plan, 3 phases, each one designed to build upon the last. Phase 1 was infiltration, not of the company, but of the system of people who orbited Mercer. Claire, Jordan, former employees, quiet observers. Each one held a piece of truth Mercer had forgotten to bury. Phase 2 was exposure. Not public exposure, but controlled exposure. Ethan knew that if Mercer sensed a threat, he would erase evidence, rewrite narratives, manipulate his way out of accountability. So Ethan needed everything lined up before lifting a single veil. Emails, logs, testimonies, timestamps, behavioral patterns, internal inconsistencies. He wanted the truth to choke Mercer from every angle at once. And phase 3, well, Ethan hadn't fully defined it yet. But it would be the final blow, the one that ensured Mercer fell so hard he could never rebuild the illusion he lived behind. One evening after a long shift at the warehouse, Ethan stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. He barely recognized the man looking back. His jaw was sharper, his eyes colder, his posture stronger. But what struck him most was the calm, an unshakable calm that lived where panic used to echo. He had transformed himself into someone who no longer bent under pressure, who no longer feared loss, who no longer needed validation to stand straight. Pain had carved him into someone precise, someone deliberate, someone dangerous, but not reckless, never reckless. He touched the mirror with his fingertips, not out of vanity, but out of realization. The man Mercer broke had been soft clay. The man in the mirror was forged metal. That night, Claire sent him another message. If you do choose to join the company, be careful around Mercer's circle. They protect him, not because they like him, but because they fear crossing him. People have tried. Ethan stared at that final line. People have tried. Feeling a cold stillness run through him, he typed a simple response. Thank you. I'm not afraid of him. Claire's reply came almost instantly. You should be. Ethan set his phone down, the corners of his mouth tightening, not in a smile, but in a quiet acknowledgement of what lay ahead. He wasn't afraid. Not because he underestimated Mercer, but because he understood him now. Understood what fear did to powerful men. Understood the cracks in their armor. Understood the silence they depended on to keep their secrets alive. And Ethan wasn't silent anymore. Ethan didn't sleep that night, not because of fear, but because his mind was finally aligning the final pieces of a plan that had lived in fragments for months. He sat at his desk long after midnight, the quiet hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room, while he organized every detail he had gathered. Claire's guarded truths, Jordan's bitter memories, the digital breadcrumbs that pointed toward Mercer's private world, and the structural weaknesses Ethan had slowly uncovered in the company's operations. He wasn't building revenge. He was constructing inevitability, and that required patience, sharper than violence. As dawn stretched across the sky, Ethan finally leaned back in his chair, exhausted but sharper than ever. His plan needed one more element, something powerful enough to crack Mercer open from the inside. Claire's mention of the personal device replayed in his mind like a quiet whisper. That device was the heart of Mercer's hidden world. If Ethan could access it, physically or digitally, he could expose everything Mercer had tried to bury, but getting near it required infiltration, and infiltration required proximity. Not fake proximity, trusted proximity. He had to get inside the company again, not as Ethan Hale the scapegoat, but as someone Mercer never saw coming. Over the next week, Ethan reshaped his identity. He polished his resume, crafted a cover story rooted in truth, but stripped of vulnerability, and prepared for an internal application that would not raise suspicion. He didn't aim for a high-ranking position that would draw attention. Instead, he targeted a logistics role tied to internal operations, something close enough to observe but low enough to be ignored. Claire didn't know who he really was, but she subtly guided him through the application process, offering practical advice without ever realizing she was giving him the keys to the building Mercer thought he controlled. Jordan, on the other hand, unknowingly provided the emotional context, the culture, the hidden fears, the employees who whispered warnings behind closed doors. With every piece collected, Ethan wove a seamless narrative that fit perfectly into the cracks of Weston and Hale's structure. He applied for the position with calm precision, expecting the process to be slow. Instead, he was surprised when he received an interview invitation within 48 hours. He knew why. Mercer's department was growing, expanding too fast for its own good, hiring whoever seemed reliable and compliant enough to carry out the work without asking difficult questions. Ethan wasn't just qualified. He looked like exactly the kind of man Mercer's team would want. Experienced, disciplined, quiet, and seemingly harmless. The morning of the interview, Ethan dressed in a crisp white shirt and charcoal jacket, his posture composed, his expression controlled. He didn't rehearse answers. He didn't need to. Truth wrapped in confidence was more powerful than memorized lines. As he stepped into the towering glass building of Weston and Hale, a strange sensation moved through him. Not fear, not nostalgia, but reclamation. He was walking into the place where his life had been dismantled, but now he walked with the posture of someone who survived the fire and returned with ice in his veins. The lobby was bright and polished, filled with employees moving in hurried rhythms, unaware of the storm walking quietly among them. Ethan checked in at the front desk, waited calmly in the seating area, and observed everything. The strained smiles, the tired eyes, the silent anxieties stitched beneath professional masks. He recognized them all because he once carried the same weight. After a short wait, he was escorted to a small conference room. 2 managers interviewed him, one eager and inexperienced, the other older and sharp-eyed. Ethan answered their questions with honesty, but with a tone that held strength, not desperation. He spoke about logistics, problem-solving, conflict resolution, and work ethic. Everything he said reflected the man he had become, not the man they once destroyed. The older manager seemed particularly interested, asking deeper questions, watching Ethan's micro-expressions for signs of deception. He found none. Ethan had nothing to hide this time. When the interview ended, their handshake was firm, respectful, and without hesitation. Ethan left the building with a quiet certainty. He would be hired. 3 days later, the offer email arrived. He sat in his apartment staring at it, not with victory, but with calm acknowledgement. Phase 1 was complete. He accepted the job. His first day back at Weston and Hale felt surreal, not because the building overwhelmed him, but because it didn't. The hallways that once held his fear now held his purpose. Ethan moved through the office with quiet discipline, absorbing everything. The new faces, the shifts in culture, the blind spots in security, the hidden currents of tension beneath Mercer's leadership. Claire saw him for the first time in person during a departmental orientation. She didn't know him, not truly, but her eyes lingered on him more than the others, as if sensing something unspoken. She offered a polite smile, the same tired one she used in every corporate photo, but there was something else behind it, a silent relief that someone finally listened to her warnings. Ethan nodded respectfully, revealing nothing. Trust was a currency he spent with precision. Over the next weeks, Ethan settled into the rhythm of the job, delivering reports, analyzing internal workflows, observing patterns. He kept his head down, worked efficiently, and slowly blended into the structure like a ghost with a badge. But beneath that quiet exterior, every moment was calculated. He learned where Mercer held his private meetings, which assistants handled his schedule, where the personal device was most likely stored during work hours, and who in Mercer's inner circle was the weakest link. Claire became an unexpected compass. She never asked personal questions, never pried, but every time she warned him about a meeting or suggested a safer approach to dealing with Mercer's team, Ethan felt the faint pull of humanity he thought he had buried on the mountain. She reminded him that not everyone in the building was an enemy. Some were survivors just like him. People who had been burned but learned to live in the ashes. and he respected her for it. He finally saw Mercer again 2 weeks into the job. It happened in the hallway near the executive offices. Mercer walked out of a meeting room flanked by 2 department leads, reviewing something on his personal device, the same hidden phone Claire had mentioned. Ethan didn't slow down, didn't look away, didn't freeze. He walked past Mercer with the quiet confidence of a man who had no reason to fear him. Mercer didn't recognize him, not at all. He glanced at Ethan briefly, eyes unfocused, then returned to his screen. The moment lasted only seconds, but it revealed everything Ethan needed to know. Mercer never looked at the people he stepped on, never remembered their faces, never thought they would rise again. That blindness would become his destruction. That night, Ethan wrote one sentence in his notebook. He doesn't see me. Good. Because a man who doesn't see the danger standing beside him is the easiest man to destroy. Ethan arrived at the office the next morning with the same quiet steadiness he carried into every place that once might have broken him. But this time, something was different. He felt it the moment he stepped through the revolving glass doors, like the air inside the building recognized him even if the people didn't. He wasn't just an employee walking in for another day of work. He was a ghost returning to reclaim the life he'd been forced to abandon. A man walking through the ashes of his past with the steel of his future already forming in his mind. He moved through the lobby with measured steps, absorbing the rhythm of the building, the way conversations rose and fell, the way employees clutched their coffee cups like armor against the day. This place once devoured him. Now he walked as if he owned every shadow inside it. His department felt unusually tense that morning. Claire sat at her desk typing quickly, shoulders stiff, eyes slightly red, as if she'd slept poorly or not at all. She offered him a small nod when their eyes met, but she looked away almost instantly, not from rudeness, but from pressure. It was subtle, but Ethan recognized it at once. The building was holding its breath. Something was brewing behind the polished walls and forced smiles. He took his seat quietly and began reviewing the day's workflow, though his attention never drifted far from Claire. He didn't need her to speak for him to sense danger. People under pressure always left traces, twitches, hesitations, glances at closed doors. Claire was trying to stay composed, but the truth was leaking through cracks she didn't notice. Within an hour, he understood why. A company-wide announcement popped up on everyone's screens, a mandatory meeting for all department staff later that afternoon, the kind of meeting with vague language that corporate leadership loved to hide behind. Structural adjustments, performance evaluations, and reorganization toward productivity. In every company he'd worked in, those phrases meant the same thing. Someone was cutting heads, burying tracks, or shifting blame. And based on the sudden tightness in Claire's posture, Ethan knew exactly whose shadow was behind it. Daniel Mercer wasn't just moving pieces. He was preparing to rewrite another story, just like he had done with Ethan years before. Ethan watched Claire breathe through the tension, the way her fingers trembled slightly when she reached for her water bottle, the way she kept glancing toward Mercer's office door, half expecting something or someone to appear. He didn't approach her right away, not because he didn't care, but because timing mattered. Rushing her would only make her retreat. That was something he'd learned in the mountains. Pressure breaks what should be shaped gently. So he waited. He worked. He listened to the space around him, to the small details other people ignored. The hurried footsteps of Mercer's assistant, the hushed argument happening behind a frosted glass wall. The tight-lipped silence of employees pretending everything was normal. Fear lived in the air like another employee. Around noon, when the office emptied slightly for lunch, Claire stepped away from her desk and walked toward the break room. Ethan followed a few minutes later, keeping his distance to avoid suspicion. He found her standing near the counter, pouring herself coffee with hands not as steady as she wanted them to be. For a moment, she didn't notice him. Caught in thoughts she was trying to control, and he saw the weight she carried more clearly than ever. Not just exhaustion, fear of something she had seen too closely for too long. "You okay?" Ethan's voice was low, even, without pressure. Claire startled slightly but quickly steadied herself. "Yeah, just tired." Her voice didn't match the lie. Ethan stepped closer but kept enough space to make her feel safe. "If the meeting later is what's bothering you, you don't have to pretend everyone's tense." She looked at him then, really looked, as if searching his face for reasons to trust him. "These meetings never go well," she said quietly, "and when Mercer leads them, they go worse." Ethan kept his expression neutral. "He's making changes?" Claire hesitated. Her eyes flicked toward the door, making sure they were alone. "He's been under pressure from upper management. There were some issues with last quarter's reports, and whenever something goes wrong here—" She paused, her voice sinking softer. "He always finds someone to blame." Her meaning hung in the air like smoke. Ethan understood it perfectly. Mercer was preparing another scapegoat, another innocent casualty to save his career. He waited a moment before responding. "How many times has he done that?" Claire exhaled slowly, a sound of someone who had been waiting years for someone to ask that question. "More than people realize. He hides it well. He frames things as performance issues or restructuring." She swallowed. "And no one fights back. They're too scared." Ethan absorbed her words, the quiet truth she'd held alone for so long. She wasn't dramatic or emotional or trying to stir trouble. She was stating facts she had lived through, facts she had watched other people pay for, facts that once destroyed Ethan entirely. "Is he targeting someone now?" he asked gently. Claire didn't answer right away. Her eyes flicked toward his, unsure if she should speak. And in that silence, Ethan realized she wasn't just scared for herself. She was scared he might be next. He had only just entered the company. He was new, unknown, and therefore easy to sacrifice. Finally, she whispered, "Just be careful today. He's preparing something." Ethan nodded once. "Thank you." But inside, his resolve sharpened like glass catching light. Mercer wasn't just corrupt. He was predictable. A man who hid behind systems he didn't understand well enough to anticipate a real threat. A man who thought the world was still full of Ethan Hales who could be crushed quietly without consequence. He was wrong. By the time the afternoon meeting began, Ethan had pieced together enough hints and whispers to know this was not a typical corporate performance session. The room filled with employees carrying tension on their shoulders like invisible weight. Mercer stood at the front, polished, rehearsed, radiating false authority. His eyes scanned the room like a man inspecting soldiers he didn't trust. "Thank you all for being here," he began, voice too smooth to be genuine. "As many of you know, the last quarter has brought challenges, and leadership must take decisive steps toward restructuring for optimal performance." Under the polished corporate language, Ethan heard the truth. He needed someone to bleed for his mistakes. Ethan kept his expression calm, body relaxed, but every sense focused. He watched Mercer closely, every gesture, every pause, every calculated look. The man moved like someone accustomed to being believed, someone who expected compliance, someone who never considered the possibility of resistance. Claire sat 2 rows over, hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on Mercer with a mixture of tension and resignation. She already knew someone was going to be targeted. Ethan suspected she feared it would be her. But as Mercer continued, Ethan noticed something. Mercer wasn't looking at Claire. He wasn't looking at the older employees either. He kept glancing, not directly, but in subtle flickers, toward Ethan. Ethan felt the shift like a cold breeze. Mercer was trying to choose him, the new guy, the unknown, the perfect scapegoat. Ethan stayed still, as controlled as stone. He let Mercer talk, let him spin the narrative, let him build the web. Because a man weaving lies always reveals the thread he doesn't want anyone to see. When the meeting ended, Tension spread through the room like fog. People left quickly, whispering, avoiding eye contact, afraid of being associated with whoever Mercer planned to sacrifice. Mercer didn't look at Ethan directly, but Ethan felt the man's attention like static in the air. Mercer had made his choice. He thought Ethan would break like the others before him. He had no idea who he was dealing with. As the room emptied, Claire approached him quietly. "Ethan, if he tries to blame you, don't fight him alone. He's dangerous." Ethan shook his head softly. "I'm not afraid of him." She swallowed, eyes filled with worry she didn't know how to hide. "You should be." Ethan met her gaze with calm steel. "He should be afraid of me." Claire froze, startled by the quiet power in his voice. He didn't speak like a man bluffing. He spoke like a man who had seen the worst and walked through it. That night, Ethan didn't go home lost or shaken. He went home ready. He sat at his desk, opened his notebook, and wrote one sentence. Phase 2 begins now. Mercer was preparing to sacrifice him, but Ethan Hale was not a man who broke anymore. He was a man who created consequences, and the first consequence was coming for Daniel Mercer. Ethan arrived the next morning sharper than the day before, carrying with him a controlled stillness that felt like armor pressed beneath his skin. The entire floor was restless, energized in the wrong way, like an electrical charge building in the walls before a storm. People whispered at their desks, glanced nervously at closed doors, watched the hallway as if a predator might appear at any second. Mercer had done this. He had infected the building with uncertainty, letting fear sink into the cracks. Fear made people compliant. Fear made them blind. Fear kept them from resisting when someone like Mercer chose a victim. And Mercer, in his arrogance, still couldn't see that the man he'd chosen this time wasn't the soft, desperate version of Ethan he remembered. He was choosing a man who walked in silence but carried a mind sharper than the blade Mercer thought he was holding. Ethan settled into his desk, opening files he didn't need to read just yet. His focus wasn't on tasks. His focus was on the shifts around him. Who was avoiding eye contact? Who was too comfortable? Who looked relieved? Who seemed guilty? Fear created strange patterns, and Ethan could read every single one. Claire was tense the moment she walked in, her body stiff, her mouth tight, her eyes darting quickly toward Mercer's door every few minutes. She knew something was coming. Probably heard something. She always absorbed the building's whispers before anyone else. Eventually, when she walked past Ethan's desk carrying a stack of folders, her hand brushed the edge of his cubicle wall as if to get his attention without being obvious. She didn't stop walking, didn't turn, but dropped a small note on the corner of his desk so casually no one else would have noticed. "He plans to call you in today. Be ready." Ethan slid the note beneath a file without changing his expression. His heart didn't speed up. His breath didn't change. He had expected this. Mercer would strike quickly before Ethan had time to develop a reputation or allies. He wanted the new guy gone before anyone questioned it, before anyone looked deeper, before truth had time to surface. But Ethan was already 10 steps ahead. He spent the first half of the morning studying department logs, tracing inconsistencies Mercer thought were buried. Some of them were sloppy. Last-minute adjustments made to cover missing funds, shifts in departmental budgets that didn't align with performance reports, accounts reassigned for no logical reason. Ethan smiled faintly. Mercer wasn't as careful as he believed. He was arrogant, and arrogance always left fingerprints. Around noon, Mercer's assistant stepped out of his office and scanned the floor until she found Ethan. "He'd like to see you," she said, her voice neutral, but her eyes tight with unease. She wasn't part of Mercer's games. She was just surviving him. Ethan rose slowly, adjusting his shirt cuffs with calm precision, then followed her down the hall. His steps were steady, his mind cold. He had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in the silence of that mountain cabin, not with rage, but with understanding. He knew what fear looked like. He knew what manipulation smelled like. And he knew exactly how Mercer would try to break him again. The assistant opened the office door. Mercer sat behind his desk with the confidence of a man who had destroyed others before breakfast. His suit was perfectly pressed, his smile perfectly practiced, his eyes cold enough to cut glass. "Ethan," he said, gesturing casually toward the chair across from him. "Come in." Ethan sat without hesitation. No fear. No hesitation. Just silence thick enough to unsettle anyone who wasn't used to it. Mercer leaned back, pretending to evaluate Ethan like a stern mentor. "I've reviewed your performance." He paused, letting tension fill the room, waiting for Ethan to squirm. Ethan didn't move, didn't blink. Mercer cleared his throat. "And I've noticed irregularities." There it was, the familiar script, the same manufactured indictment he'd used years ago. "Such as?" Ethan asked calmly. Mercer didn't expect the question. A flicker of irritation crossed his face, quickly masked. "Reports incomplete, delays, logs, missing signatures." His tone sharpened. Sloppiness. Ethan simply watched him, studied his body language. Mercer wasn't confident, he was rehearsing. Memorized blame. Empty accusations without evidence. He didn't have anything concrete because Ethan had done nothing wrong. He was banking on fear to make Ethan fold. "I'll need you to sign an acknowledgement," Mercer continued, sliding a document across the desk. "It states you understand the performance concerns and accept corrective action." Ethan didn't touch the paper. He studied it for a moment, then lifted his eyes slowly to meet Mercer's. "This form has no specifics," Ethan said quietly. Mercer stiffened. "It doesn't need specifics." "It does, if it's real." Mercer's face twitched. "Ethan, don't make this harder on yourself." Ethan leaned forward just slightly, not enough to appear aggressive, but enough to shift the power in the room. "If you have real concerns, put them in writing. Attach evidence, dates, files, log numbers, details." For the first time, Mercer looked unsure. People rarely challenged him. People rarely pushed back. And no one ever demanded specifics. His entire manipulative system relied on vague accusations and frightened compliance. "I'm offering you a chance to correct this quietly," Mercer snapped. "No," Ethan said softly. "You're offering me a way to take blame for something I didn't do." Silence filled the room. Heavy, cold, dangerous. Mercer broke first. "You're new here," he said sharply. "Let me give you some advice." "No," Ethan interrupted. "Let me give you some." Mercer blinked, stunned. "You don't know me," Ethan continued, voice calm but edged with steel. "You think I'm someone you can bend, someone who'll break quietly, someone who won't fight you." Mercer's jaw clenched. "You're wrong." The assistant outside shifted nervously, sensing the tension radiating through the closed door. But Ethan didn't stop. "You framed someone once," he said evenly. "You buried them. But you made one mistake." Mercer's eyes widened. "You never looked at the man you destroyed," Ethan whispered. A long pause. A crack in Mercer's composure. A faint tremor in his hand. Ethan rose slowly, controlled and confident. "If you have evidence, bring it. If you don't, stay out of my way." He turned and left without waiting for permission, leaving Mercer frozen behind his desk, realizing the script he'd used for years no longer worked. When Ethan stepped into the hallway, Claire stood by the water cooler, pretending not to look relieved. He passed her quietly, but she spoke under her breath as he walked by. "What happened?" He blinked, Ethan murmured. Her eyes widened. Back at his desk, Ethan opened his notebook and wrote 3 words. "He's afraid now." Fear in a man like Mercer was dangerous. It made him sloppy. And sloppy men exposed themselves without meaning to. That afternoon, Mercer called an emergency meeting with his inner circle. The door was closed, but voices leaked through vents. Sharp, desperate, angry. Ethan didn't need to hear every word to know Mercer was scrambling, trying to regain control, trying to regain the confidence he'd lost in a single conversation. But Ethan didn't relax. The most dangerous animal wasn't the one that attacked first, it was the one cornered, with no exits. Over the next week, Ethan worked with meticulous precision. He arrived early, stayed late, completed every task with flawless accuracy. His team began to rely on him, admire him quietly, trust him. Mercer noticed, and it terrified him. Claire became more protective, guiding Ethan away from traps Mercer set, last-minute changes, doctored files, instructions designed to create errors. Ethan avoided each one with calm defiance, and every time he did, Mercer grew more frantic. Then one evening, as the office emptied and only the low hum of ventilation remained, Claire approached Ethan with something new in her eyes, not worry, not exhaustion, fear. "He knows," she whispered. "He knows you're not scared. He's digging." Ethan closed his laptop slowly. "Let him." "No," she hissed, glancing around. "He's looking into your past." Ethan's jaw tightened. "How much does he know?" he asked. Claire swallowed. "Enough to be nervous, not enough to understand." Ethan exhaled through his nose, steady but cold. "Good. Let Mercer dig. Let him try to find the man he once destroyed. The deeper he dug, the closer he would get to the truth Ethan was preparing to deliver like a silent hammer." Claire stepped closer. "Ethan, what are you going to do?" He met her worried gaze with calm steel. "Finish what he started," he said softly. "But this time I decide the ending." The building felt colder that night as Ethan walked out into the dark. Mercer wasn't choosing a scapegoat anymore. He was choosing the man who would ruin him. And all Ethan needed was one more crack, one more mistake, one more sign of desperation. Mercer would give it to him. Men like him always did. Ethan arrived at the office the next morning with a calm so deep it almost felt like silence wrapped around his bones. He had slept, but only just enough. His mind had been restless, not from fear, but from calculation. The moment Claire told him Mercer was digging into his past, Ethan understood something clearly. Mercer wasn't simply reacting anymore. He was unraveling. A man used to control only fought this hard when he sensed something slipping out of his hands, and Mercer was losing grip faster than he realized. The building was already whispering. Employees sensed something shifting in the air. People who once avoided Ethan now watched him with uncertain curiosity, as if their instincts told them there was more to him than he showed. Even the hallways felt different, like the walls themselves were leaning in to witness what was coming. Ethan settled into his desk with quiet precision. He opened spreadsheets, reviewed reports, answered emails, all without letting the slightest hint of emotion cross his face. But inside, his mind was moving like a machine. The moment Mercer began digging, the plan entered its next stage: control the narrative by controlling the truth before he does. He had been preparing for months, gathering threads, studying patterns, unlocking weaknesses Mercer didn't know were visible. Now those threads were tightening around Mercer's world like a slow, invisible noose. Ethan wasn't going to rush. He wasn't going to confront Mercer again yet. He was going to let the man panic, let him claw desperately for answers, let him expose himself in his frantic attempts to regain control. Around mid-morning, Claire walked by his desk, pretending to deliver copies, but her voice dropped to a whisper as she leaned close. "He tried to pull your HR file this morning," she murmured. "He requested access directly." Ethan didn't look at her. He kept typing, eyes fixed on the screen. "Did he get it?" "No, he doesn't have clearance." HR flagged the request. She hesitated. "They notified upper management." Ethan paused for half a beat, not out of fear, but because this was better than he expected. Mercer was sloppy now, desperate enough to leave footprints. HR didn't ignore leaders who crossed boundaries, and Ethan knew this small misstep was the first crack in the facade Mercer had polished for years. He typed another sentence and whispered back, "Good." Claire lingered for a moment, her breath catching as if she wanted to ask the question burning behind her eyes, but she didn't. She returned to her desk quickly, shoulders tense, glancing back at him with quiet worry. Ethan watched her only briefly before turning back to his screen. Claire didn't need to worry. He knew exactly what he was doing. And more importantly, Mercer didn't. An hour later, the silence of the floor broke. Mercer's door flew open, and he stepped out with a storm carved onto his face. His assistant stumbled behind him, trying to keep up. Mercer barked orders sharp enough to cut the room in half. People froze. Even those who didn't know what was happening felt the shift. Mercer's anger wasn't normal. It wasn't focused. It was panic wearing a suit. His eyes landed on Ethan, and for the first time Ethan saw the crack of recognition in Mercer's expression. Not because he recognized Ethan's identity, but because he recognized danger. Mercer didn't look away. He studied Ethan with a predator's uncertainty, trying to piece together why the man he'd chosen as his next scapegoat refused to break, why he didn't show fear, why he didn't crumble like all the others, why he didn't sign the form, why he wasn't intimidated by the meeting, why he didn't avoid eye contact. Mercer sensed something he couldn't name. Ethan simply held his stare for a moment, not long enough to challenge, just long enough to ensure Mercer felt the shift. Then he turned back to his screen, dismissing Mercer like he was nothing more than background noise. It was the smallest gesture, but it shattered something in Mercer, because for men like him, losing control wasn't just inconvenient, it was terrifying. By afternoon, Mercer's circle was moving strangely. 2 department leads whispered in a stairwell. His assistant kept glancing at her phone with worry. HR walked through the office twice, their expressions unreadable. Claire looked like she was bracing for impact. Ethan watched it all with clinical detachment. He didn't need to push anything. The storm was building itself. All he needed to do was direct lightning when the time came. Later, as the office quieted and employees trickled out early, Mercer's assistant approached Ethan's desk slowly, nervously twisting her pen. "He wants to see you," she said, voice thin. "Now." Ethan stood, buttoned his jacket, and followed her down the hall, the slow, steady sound of his footsteps echoing like a heartbeat against polished floors. Inside Mercer's office, the tension was thick enough to taste. Mercer sat behind his desk, hands clasped tightly, trying to look in control, but failing. His eyes flicked toward the door, then to Ethan, then away again like a man searching for stable ground and finding none. "Sit," he ordered. Ethan remained standing. A flicker of frustration crossed Mercer's face. "I said sit." Ethan finally moved, but not to sit. He stepped closer, standing right in front of the chair without taking it. He didn't break eye contact. He didn't fidget. He simply existed with a presence so calm it felt like pressure. Mercer swallowed. His voice shifted. "You're not who you say you are you?" Ethan tilted his head slightly. "What do you think I am?" Mercer's jaw clenched. "Someone hiding something." "Everyone hides something," Ethan replied softly. Mercer leaned back in his chair, trying to regain the upper hand. "I'm giving you a chance. Tell me what you're doing here." Ethan's expression didn't change. "Doing my job." Mercer slammed his palm on the desk. "Don't play games with me." Ethan didn't flinch. "You're not afraid," Mercer said, his voice cracking with a mixture of anger and confusion. "Why aren't you afraid?" Ethan let the silence stretch before answering in a low, steady voice. "Because you stopped being a threat the moment you chose me." Mercer stared at him, breathing unevenly. He didn't understand. He didn't know why his intimidation cratered, why his authority slipped like water through his fingers. Men like Mercer only understood fear when they caused it. They never understood what it meant when someone stopped feeling it. "You're making a mistake," Mercer hissed. "No," Ethan said quietly. "You made one years ago." Mercer's eyes widened, confusion and fear mixing into something close to recognition. "Who are you?" he whispered. Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth wasn't for this moment. The truth was for the fall. Ethan turned and walked out, leaving Mercer in a trembling silence he couldn't escape. On his way back to his desk, Claire caught up to him in the hallway, breath shaky. "Ethan, what happened?" He looked at her with calm certainty. "He's losing control," Claire's voice cracked. "He's dangerous when he panics." "I know," Ethan said. "That's why the next step needs to be perfect." Claire grabbed his arm before he could walk away. "What are you planning?" Ethan looked down at her hand, then into her eyes. Soft, scared, loyal to a truth she barely understood. "I'm planning," he said quietly, "to take away everything he built on other people's suffering." Claire's breath caught. "And I'm going to do it without ever raising my voice." He walked away, leaving her trembling in the hallway with a mix of fear and awe, as if she was witnessing the birth of something powerful and dangerous, something she didn't know whether to run from or stand behind. That night, Ethan didn't go home. He went somewhere else. Somewhere he had been avoiding. He stood outside the old apartment building where his life had shattered years ago. He looked up at the window where he once froze in heartbreak and betrayal. He wasn't there to mourn. He wasn't there for closure. He was there to remind himself what was at stake, how far he'd come, and why he couldn't fail now. He whispered into the cold air, "You ended me here. Now I end you." Then he turned and walked into the night. Tomorrow, the real dismantling would begin, and Mercer would never see it coming. Ethan walked into the office the next morning with the kind of calm that didn't belong inside a building full of fear. He moved through the lobby like a silent current, invisible, yet undeniable, a presence people felt before they understood. Something about him had shifted overnight. Maybe it was the look in his eyes, colder, clearer, sharper than before. Maybe it was the way he carried himself. Controlled, powerful, impossible to intimidate. Or maybe it was the quiet certainty that followed every step he took, as if he wasn't just coming to work, but walking toward the final chapter of something long overdue. The air in the building felt heavy. Conversation stopped when he passed. People lowered their voices, sensing something approaching, even if they didn't know what. Word spread fast in offices like this. Mercer had erupted yesterday. Mercer had panicked. Mercer had slipped. And everyone knew what that meant. A fall was coming. They just didn't know who would be standing when the dust settled. Ethan reached his desk and opened his computer. But he didn't look at his screen right away. He watched the floor instead, watched the subtle patterns that revealed truths beneath silence. Employees avoided Mercer's office. HR walked past twice in less than an hour. Department leads whispered in glass-walled rooms. Even the assistants tread softly, as if an invisible earthquake trembled beneath the carpet. Mercer was unraveling, and unraveling men made mistakes. Ethan only needed one more. Around mid-morning, Claire approached his desk, her expression pale with something worse than fear. Certainty. She placed a single folder on his desk, pretending it was a routine delivery, but her voice was barely a breath. "He's doing something. I don't know what, but it's not good." Ethan nodded once, calm. "I know." "No," she whispered, leaning in. "Ethan, this is different. He met with upper management last night. He closed the blinds. He walked out red-faced. Something happened." Ethan didn't react. "He's losing leverage." Claire swallowed hard. "He's planning to take someone down with him. He'll burn someone else before they burn him." Ethan's eyes sharpened. Good. That's how cornered men expose themselves. Claire's breath hitched. You're too calm. Ethan finally looked at her, his voice quiet but heavy. Because I know exactly how this ends. Before she could respond, Mercer's assistant emerged from his office, her expression tight, her steps too quick. She scanned the room until her eyes landed on Ethan. He wants to see you. Claire stiffened. Ethan rose slowly. This was it. The moment Mercer would try his last strike. The moment he would choose the wrong man one final time. He walked into Mercer's office without hesitation. The door closed behind him with a soft click, soft but final, like the closing of a chapter. Mercer stood behind his desk, fists planted firmly on the surface, eyes burning with something feral. His self-control was gone, his mask cracked, his desperation now fully visible. You think you're clever? Mercer hissed. Ethan didn't sit. No. I think you're predictable. Mercer's face twitched, rage, fear, confusion, all tangled together. I know who you are. No, Ethan replied calmly. You know what you did, and you're terrified someone might finally be able to prove it. Mercer's nostrils flared. You're a liar. No, Ethan said again. Just someone you underestimated. Mercer circled the desk like a predator trying to regain the feeling of control. I spoke with HR. With upper management, with compliance. And? Ethan asked softly. Mercer froze. Ethan saw it in his eyes. The truth Mercer was too afraid to say aloud. Compliance didn't believe him. HR didn't trust him. Upper management saw something they didn't like. You're done here, Mercer said finally, voice cracking slightly. You're finished. I don't need proof, I just need authority. Ethan's expression barely moved. Then show it, Mercer snapped. I don't owe you an explanation. Ethan stepped closer. Then why are you yelling? Mercer recoiled as if struck. Silence stretched between them, heavy, pulsing, shifting the balance of the room. Ethan leaned in. If you were in control, you wouldn't need to raise your voice. You wouldn't need to panic. You wouldn't need to scramble for evidence. Mercer's voice faltered. Ethan finished for him. You're desperate. Mercer lunged for a file on his desk, their department's performance review, twisted into something it wasn't. I have enough to fire you. Ethan shook his head slowly. You have papers filled with nothing. Mercer's lips curled. No one will question me. But for the first time, even he didn't believe his own words. Ethan spoke quietly, coldly. They already are. Mercer stiffened. His eyes darted involuntarily toward the window, toward the employees outside, toward HR walking past, toward whispers he could no longer contain. Get out, Mercer whispered. No, Mercer blinked. What? No, Ethan repeated. Not until we're done. Mercer's breathing quickened. What do you want? Ethan stepped around the desk, closing the distance between them until Mercer had no choice but to face him fully. The truth. Mercer shook his head violently. You can't prove anything. Not yet, Ethan said, but I will. He turned toward the door. And when I do, he added softly, you won't just lose your job. You'll lose everything you stole to get it. He opened the door and walked out. Mercer didn't follow. He couldn't. He collapsed into his chair, drowning in the one feeling he had spent years inflicting on others, fear, the real kind. The kind that didn't fade. Ethan walked back to his desk, feeling the shift ripple through the office like silent thunder. Claire rushed up to him, eyes wide. What happened? He's slipping, Ethan said simply. Ethan, I'm scared. I know. His voice softened for the first time. But you won't be for long. That afternoon, Ethan began the final phase of his plan. He pulled records Mercer thought were hidden. He gathered statements Mercer didn't know were documented. He collected inconsistencies, timestamps, deleted messages recovered through internal logs. He found financial discrepancies Mercer had buried. He found emails with red flags the company ignored. He even uncovered reports employees had filed quietly. Complaints that went unanswered. retaliation disguised as restructuring, and then he tied them together, not as revenge, as truth. Truth sharp enough to cut, silent enough to spread, undeniable enough to collapse everything Mercer built like a house of glass. Ethan spent the next 2 days creating a detailed report, not emotional, not dramatic, just factual, clean, devastating evidence. Dates, logs, internal data, digital footprints. Mercer didn't know he'd left. Statements from former employees, patterns of intimidation. Claire helped quietly, terrified but determined, feeding him files Mercer assumed she'd never dare share. When Ethan finished, he sent the full report to HR, compliance, legal, upper management, and the external audit team the company feared most. Then he closed his laptop calmly. The storm didn't hit immediately. It hit the next morning. Mercer walked into the office looking like a man who hadn't slept in days. He stormed toward HR. They refused to meet privately. He stormed into legal. They closed the door behind him. He shouted, argued, waved documents. None of it mattered. Ethan watched from his desk, expression unreadable. By noon, Mercer's badge access was revoked. By 2 p.m., security escorted him out. Employees watched from their desks, stunned. Some whispered, some stared, some even smiled. Small, hidden smiles of people who had waited too long for justice. Claire's eyes filled with tears she couldn't hide. Mercer passed Ethan in the hallway on his way out, surrounded by security, his face drained of color, his eyes locked on Ethan. For the first time, recognition hit him like a strike. "You," Mercer whispered hoarsely. "You were—" Ethan said nothing. He didn't need to. Mercer was gone before he finished the sentence, just like that. The man who once destroyed Ethan's life was escorted out of the building he'd risen through on lies. And Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't break a rule. He didn't lose control. He simply held up a mirror Mercer couldn't escape. That evening, Claire approached Ethan slowly. "You saved people," she whispered. "You saved all of us." Ethan shook his head gently. "I didn't save anyone." Claire frowned. "Then what did you do?" "I stopped a man who never should have been allowed to hold power." She stared at him, understanding the weight of those words more deeply than anyone else could. Ethan packed his things calmly, not to leave in fear, but to leave on his own terms. Claire reached out, touching his arm. "Ethan, where will you go?" He looked at her with quiet resolve. "Somewhere new, somewhere honest." She nodded, tears pooling. "I hope they deserve you." Ethan gave her the smallest, softest smile. "Maybe one day." He walked out of the building as the sun set. The sky painted in colors that didn't belong to pain anymore. He stepped into the evening air with a steady breath and a heart no longer carrying the weight of what had been taken from him. His past was behind him, his future wide open, his armor unbreakable. He didn't walk away as the man Mercer destroyed. He walked away as the man he rebuilt from the ground up, a man no betrayal could bend, a man no system could control, a man no fear could break. Ethan Hale was free, and this time he was free on his own terms.